All right, so this week is Kant. We move into a new moral theory. Utilitarianism is all about consequences. It's all about how do you produce the most happiness. So whatever action produces the most happiness is going to be considered the good action, the action that one ought to perform. With Kant, we're in a little bit of a different situation. He's going to say, look, there's certain things that are right no matter what. Even if the actions and the consequences are disastrous, even if they're the worst, even if they produce, terrible consequences, there are certain things that are right and certain things that are wrong. And in his moral theory, the way he comes up with the right thing to do is there's really a couple criteria, a couple tests. And these are associated with what he calls the categorical imperative. So the categorical imperative is really a rule again, that you can think of it as having two tests that an action has to pass before it's considered moral. If it doesn't pass both of these tests, the action is not moral and you should not do it. And one of those tests is this idea that you're to treat every rational creature as an end rather than a means. So every rational creature, every person who is reasonable, who has reason, that person deserves absolute dignity. You ought to respect them, which means you ought to be honest with them. You ought to be able to tell them why you're doing what you're doing and let them come to the conclusion that they're going to come to in terms of their action. You cannot use them, which means that you treat them fundamentally as something that is useful to you. So when you think about their value, when you think about their role in your life, and you're thinking primarily in terms of, well, what can I get from this person? That is being immoral because you're using that person. The other aspect of the categorical imperative is what they call the means, not the means end principle, excuse me. This principle is where you call the principle of universalization. And here, you're really taking your action, you're asking yourself, well, why am I doing what I'm doing? What is the justification? What is my rationale? What is my, thinking here? What is my reasoning? And then you universalize it, you apply it to everyone. And if it is able to remain consistent and coherent, then you've got a potentially moral action. If it is to remain inconsistent and incoherent, you've got a potentially immoral action. Or you do have an immoral action, simply by being inconsistent and incoherent. So here's an example. Many people have cheated on a test in their lives. And so when you cheat on a test, you might cheat because, hey, you haven't prepared, or you want a better grade, and essentially you say, I want a better grade, so therefore I will cheat. But if everyone followed your logic, which is essentially cheat when you want a better grade, then the whole point of cheating would be undermined. It would become inconsistent and incoherent. Because if everyone followed your logic, well, then grades would become meaningless. No one could trust anything on a test. There'd be no point to taking tests because they wouldn't in any way evaluate your merit. They wouldn't be in any way indications that you knew the material, had studied. So when you do that, when everybody uses your logic, in a certain sense, your goal falls apart because you can no longer accomplish it. It no longer matters if you get a good grade if everyone uses your logic because grades don't mean anything. Think about it the same way. Run a red light when you're in a rush. If everyone followed that logic, well, then there would be traffic chaos. And essentially, you wouldn't be getting anywhere in a rush quickly because the roads would become hazardous. The roads would become incredibly dangerous. And in that case, the whole point of going fast and being in a rush and running the red light would be undermined because if everyone followed your rule, your reasoning, you wouldn't be getting anywhere quickly. So essentially what's immoral is you're saying, I want to do this action, I want to follow this justification, but I don't want others to do so as well. And that's what's immoral. You're really kind of making an exception for yourself. The other big point of Kantian morality, this is called the principle of the goodwill. And the goodwill essentially says the only truly good person is the person who does what is right for no other reason than it is right. They do it because it is the right thing to do. And that is the only good person. You're doing what you're doing simply because it's right. You're not doing it because it makes you happy. You're not doing it because you desire it. Anybody who does things on those grounds is not truly moral and may, in fact, be immoral. The only proper basis to perform an action is because it's the right thing to do. So here's an example I give in the lecture notes. Imagine two students who are going to class. One student goes because it's the right thing to do. They're supposed to be there. That's what a student does. That's their duty. And they show up and that's it. The other student goes to class because they like it. They're happy. That's their motivation. That's what gets them there. The first student is moral, while the second student is not truly moral. It doesn't necessarily mean they're bad, but it does mean that they're amoral. So the reason there, and a lot of people reject that example, the reason that he says this is because, look, if you act on desires change. Desires, 1 minute this makes you happy, another minute this makes you happy. This action makes this person happy, while it doesn't make another person happy. Desires and happiness, they're too inconsistent, they're too volatile, they're too subjective. And so Kant thinks they're never a valid principle upon which to base a moral decision. Because sometimes your feelings may lead you to do what is moral, but sometimes they don't. And so that's why, if you're going to truly be moral and follow the moral life, the only truly moral path to follow is that of reason and the categorical imperative and doing what you're doing because it's the right thing to do. Okay, so this week you have your discussion boards. I believe you have a short assignment due. As always, watch the videos. Sorry they're a little bit late this week. And also read the lecture notes. Those help. And, there is the Sunday night conference call, which I invite you on each week.